They humiliated him but froze when he took the judge's seat. The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet streets of Eastwood, a neighborhood that usually went about its day in relative peace. But today an unsettling tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Officer Ryan Caldwell and his partner, Officer Mark Jensen, drove slowly down the block in their squad car, their eyes scanning the familiar faces that dotted the sidewalks. It was a routine patrol, or at least that's what they told themselves. Yet their mission today was far from routine. They had been tipped off about a so-called troublemaker, a young Latino man named Antonio Ramirez. He was known in the neighborhood for his outspoken nature and, according to some neighbors, his tendency to challenge authority. But to Antonio, speaking up was simply a matter of dignity. When the officers spotted him standing near a corner store, casually leaning against the wall and chatting with friends, they pulled over. Antonio, in his mid-30s, was tall with sharp features and a calm demeanor. He had nothing in his hands, nothing threatening, yet the officers exited the vehicle with an energy that suggested they expected a confrontation. "Mr. Ramirez," Caldwell said, his voice heavy with unwarranted authority, "we need you to come with us." Antonio raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? For what?" The response was a shrug from Jensen, who already had the handcuffs out. "Just come quietly. It'll be easier for everyone." But Antonio wasn't the type to submit blindly. He tried to reason with them, asking politely what he was being accused of, reminding them that no law allowed an officer to detain someone without cause. The words fell on deaf ears. The officers grabbed him roughly, ignoring his protests. Antonio's friends watched in disbelief as he was shoved into the back of the patrol car. The ride to the station was silent except for the occasional muttered instructions from the officers. Antonio kept his composure, sitting upright, hands cuffed in front of him, eyes fixed straight ahead. He knew something about this arrest felt wrong, but he also knew that arguing wouldn't make a difference. Inside the station, the real indignity began. They led him to a small, sterile room, the walls painted a dull gray. The harsh fluorescent lights made everything look harsher, colder. Caldwell and Jensen took turns shoving him into a chair. "We're just going to make you look presentable for booking," Caldwell sneered. Before Antonio could react, they grabbed clippers and began shaving his head. Each buzz of the clippers felt like an insult to his identity, a violation that went deeper than physical appearance. Antonio gritted his teeth, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to speak, to remind them that he had rights, that he wasn't just another faceless suspect. But the officers were relentless, and the sound of hair falling to the floor was deafening in the small room. By the time they were done, Antonio sat there with a bare scalp, a mix of humiliation and fury burning in his eyes. He wasn't crying. He refused to give them that satisfaction. But his silence spoke volumes. The officers laughed among themselves, convinced that they had demonstrated power, control. They left him in the room for a few moments before escorting him to the holding cell. Antonio ran his fingers over his scalp, feeling the starkness of what had just happened. As he sat alone, the weight of the situation began to sink in. He had done nothing illegal, nothing that warranted this treatment. The absurdity of being humiliated like this for simply existing in his own neighborhood gnawed at him. Yet even in that moment, he didn't despair. He knew the law, and he knew that he had more than just courage on his side. He had truth, and one day that truth would flip the situation entirely. Meanwhile, outside the station, the officers recounted their accomplishment with a sense of pride. They didn't realize that the man they had just humiliated had connections that ran deeper than they could imagine. Antonio wasn't just another resident. He was also an appointed magistrate in a nearby jurisdiction, a fact that would soon turn this entire ordeal upside down. Back in the cell, Antonio's thoughts raced. He thought about the countless times he had seen injustice in the system, the times people were punished without cause while those in uniform assumed unquestionable authority. But he also thought about the law, about his oath to uphold it, about the power of due process. He realized that this incident wasn't just a personal attack. It was a test of his patience, of his resolve, and of the very system that had placed him in a position of respect and responsibility. Hours passed, and the day began to fade into evening. The station was quieter now, the officers finishing paperwork and sharing stories about the arrest. Antonio, still seated in the holding cell, finally saw an opportunity. When Caldwell opened the door to move him, Antonio's calm voice stopped him. "You're about to make a mistake," he said evenly. Caldwell smirked, dismissive. "And what's that?" Antonio stood slowly, deliberately. "You don't know who I am." The words hung in the air, almost absurd given the situation. Caldwell laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Try me." Then Antonio took action. In a swift motion, he pulled himself together with a confidence that was almost impossible to ignore. "I am Judge Antonio Ramirez," he said. "A sitting judge in this county. You are currently detaining me illegally, and every action you've taken is being recorded. Every word, every move. You've just committed multiple offenses." The room went silent. Caldwell and Jensen froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. Their laughter died on their lips. They hadn't checked the system. They hadn't realized that the man they thought they were punishing had the authority to undo everything they had just done, legally and immediately. Antonio's calm, unshakable demeanor now carried the weight of the law itself. "Call your sergeant," Antonio instructed, his voice steady, "and prepare to explain yourself. You are not above the law, not today." For the first time, Caldwell's confident posture faltered. He exchanged a nervous glance with Jensen, who looked like a cornered animal. They had thought this was routine, a simple display of control, but they had underestimated Antonio in every possible way. Antonio's eyes swept the room, taking in the clippers, the hair on the floor, the handcuffs still on his wrists. Each object was a testament to their arrogance, but also evidence. Evidence that would hold them accountable. His mind raced through the legal procedures, the immediate steps he needed to take. He wasn't just going to walk out. He was going to make sure that justice was seen and felt. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted completely. What began as an act of humiliation had now transformed into a reckoning. The officers who had believed themselves untouchable now faced the stark reality that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Antonio Ramirez, head freshly shaved, cuffed, and calm, now held the power, and he intended to wield it, not with vengeance, but with the unyielding force of the law. The early evening light filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Antonio Ramirez walked through the grand entrance, his head still bare from the humiliating haircut earlier, but his steps were steady, deliberate, and filled with an authority that could not be questioned. Each echo of his shoes on the marble floor seemed to announce a shift in power, a heralding of justice long overdue. The courthouse was quiet, the staff wrapping up the day's work, unaware of the storm that was about to descend. Caldwell and Jensen had been called into the courthouse under the guise of reporting to a sergeant, but when they arrived, they were confronted with an impossible reality. Antonio had requested an immediate audience with the presiding judge, and in a twist that would feel surreal to anyone watching, he was allowed access to the chambers. He wasn't there as a petitioner or witness. He was there in his capacity as a sitting judge. The officers froze in the ornate hallway, their previous confidence replaced by unease. The echoes of their own arrogance now felt like chains around their necks. Antonio entered the chambers, his presence commanding even without the robe he normally wore in court. He was calm, composed, eyes sharp and unflinching. The officers followed reluctantly, handcuffs still dangling from their hands, a physical reminder of the roles reversed. Antonio gestured to the empty judge's seat at the bench, the symbol of authority that they had never anticipated facing. "Sit," he said, pointing to the bench. "You've earned a seat in front of justice." "Take it." Caldwell and Jensen hesitated. This was not part of any training manual, not part of any arrest protocol. They looked at each other, seeking some semblance of reassurance, but found only mirrored fear. Antonio's voice cut through the silence, steady and unwavering. "Every action you took today, every unlawful detainment, every act of humiliation is now on record, and I am going to ensure it is addressed properly, immediately." He rose from his chair and approached the officers, his posture relaxed yet intimidating. He wasn't angry. His composure made their misdeeds seem small, even absurd. Yet the law he carried with him was a weight they could not ignore. He motioned toward the courthouse clerk, who had been summoned to witness the unfolding events. "Please record this entire interaction. Every word, every detail. Let the record reflect the truth." Caldwell swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Judge, we didn't know." His words faltered, lost somewhere between fear and a desperate attempt to regain control. Jensen, equally pale, tried to interject, but Antonio raised a hand, silencing them instantly. Ignorance is not an excuse for unlawful action. You were trained, you were aware, and yet you chose humiliation over procedure. Today that choice will be accounted for. The officers were guided to stand before the bench, their earlier bravado completely stripped away. Antonio, now seated in his official capacity, began a methodical recounting of the events. He described the unlawful detainment, the unwarranted use of force, and the humiliating act of shaving his head. Every word was precise, deliberate, and infused with authority. The officers realized with growing horror that this was no ordinary complaint. This was the law speaking directly to them, unfiltered and unavoidable. The courthouse staff, initially curious, began to gather at a respectful distance, witnessing a scene that defied ordinary expectation. A man who had been humiliated, detained without cause, and treated with contempt was now seated as the embodiment of the very justice they had so brazenly disregarded. The symbolism was palpable, almost cinematic in its gravity. Antonio's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's tense, faltering movements. Then came the moment that would cement the reality of the power shift. Antonio called out to the court security officer on duty. "Escort these officers to a private conference room. They will remain there while I review the full incident report and the applicable statutes. They are not free to leave, and they will cooperate fully." Caldwell and Jensen exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. They had believed they were untouchable, that the law only constrained others. Now, under the gaze of a man they had thought powerless just hours before, their reality shattered. Antonio's instructions were firm but calm, leaving no room for negotiation. Once the officers were secured in the conference room, Antonio leaned back in the judge's seat, letting the weight of the moment settle around him. His head, bare from the earlier incident, was a stark contrast to the robe and authority he usually carried, yet it made his presence even more commanding. There was no need for theatrics. His calm, unwavering command was enough to demonstrate that the law was not just words on paper, but a force that demanded respect and accountability. He thought about the hours leading up to this moment, the humiliation, the anger, the injustice. And yet he also recognized a deeper lesson. Power without responsibility is dangerous, but authority wielded with wisdom can correct the gravest mistakes. This was a teaching moment, not just for the officers, but for the entire department and community that would inevitably learn of this incident. Antonio called for the station's incident report and evidence to be brought to the courthouse immediately. Every hair clipped from his head, every word spoken in the holding cell, every procedural misstep was meticulously documented. He would ensure that nothing was left to interpretation, that the law itself would speak louder than fear or arrogance. By the time the documents arrived, Antonio had already begun outlining the charges, the potential disciplinary measures, and the mandatory training programs that would be required to prevent such a breach of conduct in the future. His mind worked like a precision instrument, each step calculated, each decision grounded in legal precedent and the ethical responsibility of his office. Meanwhile, back in the conference room, Caldwell and Jensen sat in stunned silence. They had anticipated an argument, perhaps a fine, maybe a reprimand, but this was beyond anything they could have imagined. They were no longer the arbiters of power. They were subjects under scrutiny, accountable in a way that left no room for denial or evasion. Every instinct that had once given them confidence now betrayed them, replaced by a creeping, inescapable dread. And as Antonio sat at the bench, reviewing the reports and organizing the next steps, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had faced injustice countless times before, but today was different. Today the law itself had sided with truth and integrity, allowing him not just to defend his own dignity, but to demonstrate the consequences of abusing authority. Outside the chambers, word of the incident began to ripple through the courthouse. Staff whispered in hushed tones, the story growing with every retelling. By the end of the day, it was no longer just a personal triumph. It was a lesson, a warning, and a story that would echo through the department for years to come. Antonio Ramirez, once humiliated and restrained, now embodied justice itself, calm and composed yet unyielding. And the officers who had thought themselves untouchable had learned a lesson in accountability that no training manual could ever teach. The balance of power had shifted, and the courthouse, once silent, now resonated with the undeniable truth. The law, when wielded rightly, is more powerful than fear, arrogance, or intimidation. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with activity, but nothing could distract from the tension that hung in the air. Word of Antonio Ramirez's confrontation with the officers had already begun to circulate among staff and a few select local reporters who had caught wind of the story. The idea that a man had been humiliated by law enforcement only to take his seat as a judge and immediately assert accountability seemed almost cinematic. Yet for those who had witnessed it firsthand, it was real, raw, and profoundly transformative. Antonio arrived early, robe neatly draped over his shoulders now, head still bare but his presence commanding. The previous day's events had solidified his resolve. There would be no leniency, no delay, no room for manipulation. Caldwell and Jensen were brought before him once again, now in the official capacity of a formal disciplinary hearing. The atmosphere was electric. Courthouse staff, court clerks, and a few law enforcement liaisons watched in silent anticipation as the two officers, still pale and stiff from the prior encounter, were escorted to the front of the chamber. Antonio began the proceedings by addressing them directly, his voice calm but piercing. "You are here because of actions that were not only unbecoming of law enforcement officers, but were outright violations of the law. You detained me without probable cause, subjected me to physical and psychological humiliation, and failed to uphold the oath you swore to protect and serve the public. Today we will begin to address those violations." Caldwell tried to interject, his tone nervous, almost pleading. "Judge Ramirez, we didn't know—" "Silence," Antonio said firmly. "Ignorance of the law is never a defense. What you did was deliberate, and now you must face the consequences." Antonio called for the presentation of evidence, photos from the holding cell, video from the station's security cameras, and testimony from the officers' colleagues were all laid out meticulously. Each piece told the same story: a man detained without cause, forcibly humiliated, and treated with contempt. As Antonio presented the evidence, he did so not with anger but with precision, demonstrating how each action violated departmental protocol, state law, and federal civil rights protections. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their earlier confidence, the bravado that had carried them through their patrol, had crumbled entirely. Now, stripped of pretense, they were faced with the undeniable truth of their misconduct. Jensen's hands trembled slightly and Caldwell's jaw clenched as they realized that this wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability, about the long-term consequences of arrogance and abuse of power. Antonio then turned his attention to the broader implications of their actions. This is not just a personal matter. This is a violation that undermines public trust in law enforcement. When officers act above the law, they erode the very foundation they are sworn to protect. Your actions today are a stark example of what happens when power is wielded without responsibility. The gravity of the moment was palpable. Antonio's words resonated not only with the officers before him, but with everyone present in the chamber. Even the courthouse staff, who had seen their fair share of drama, could feel the weight of justice being administered in a way that was both immediate and uncompromising. Next, Antonio addressed the potential consequences for Caldwell and Jensen. "You will be suspended immediately, pending further investigation. Internal Affairs will conduct a full review of your conduct, and I will ensure that your actions are thoroughly examined. Depending on the outcome, criminal charges may also be pursued. Let this serve as a warning. No one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it." The officers' faces went pale. Caldwell's voice broke as he said, "Judge Ramirez, please, we didn't mean—" Antonio raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Intent does not excuse outcome. Your actions caused harm. You humiliated an individual unjustly, and that is unacceptable. You will answer for it fully." At that moment, Antonio's thoughts briefly wandered to the wider community. He knew that what he was doing would send a message far beyond the walls of this courthouse. Eastwood had always struggled with trust issues regarding law enforcement, and he recognized that a decisive public demonstration of accountability could begin to repair that relationship. Justice wasn't just personal, it was communal. By confronting these officers directly and transparently, he was showing the community that abuse of power would not be tolerated, that dignity and respect were non-negotiable. He then allowed the officers to speak, if only to hear their acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Jensen, his voice quivering, finally admitted, "Yes, Judge Ramirez, we acted wrong. We didn't follow procedure. We were wrong." Caldwell, slightly more defiant at first, eventually nodded as well. We understand, Judge. We were wrong." Antonio listened, letting the words settle in the room. Acknowledgement was a necessary first step, but it was not the end. Consequences were essential to ensure that such violations were never repeated. He instructed the officers that they would be required to attend sensitivity and procedural training, write formal apologies, and undergo supervised community service to repair the damage done to public trust. By mid-morning, news of the hearing had begun to leak. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, eager for statements, eager to capture the story of a man who had been humiliated, yet had taken control of the situation with grace and authority. Antonio allowed a brief statement carefully measured. "Today, accountability begins. No one is above the law. Justice is not a concept, it is a responsibility, and it will be upheld." The story quickly gained traction online and through local news outlets. Social media lit up with reactions, many praising Antonio's calm and decisive handling of the situation. Memes and discussions circulated, highlighting the stark reversal of roles. The officers who had humiliated a man now found themselves humbled by the very system they had sworn to enforce. Antonio's message resonated. Dignity, law, and truth were forces far more powerful than intimidation or misuse of authority. Meanwhile, back inside the courthouse, Antonio continued to guide the process. He oversaw the completion of internal paperwork, ensured that all procedures were properly documented, and coordinated with internal affairs to guarantee that no detail was overlooked. Every decision, every directive was executed with the precision of someone who understood both the law and the human consequences of ignoring it. By the end of the day, Caldwell and Jensen were no longer figures of authority. They were subjects of justice, accountable to a system they had once disregarded. The officers had been humbled, but Antonio's approach was more than punitive. It was educational, transformative. He had taken humiliation and turned it into a teaching moment, one that would echo through the precinct and the community for years. As the courthouse emptied that evening, Antonio remained at his bench reflecting on the events. He thought of his own resilience, the courage it had taken to remain calm in the face of humiliation. He thought of the officers whose arrogance had brought them to this moment, and he hoped that the experience would leave a lasting impact. Justice, he knew, was not simply about punishment, it was about accountability, transformation, and the restoration of trust. And in that quiet moment, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The law had spoken. Justice had been restored. And a message had been sent loud and clear. No one, no matter how powerful they believe themselves to be, is above the reach of truth and accountability. The following morning, Eastwood was buzzing with anticipation. Word of Antonio Ramirez's confrontation with Caldwell and Jensen had spread like wildfire. Residents gathered near the courthouse, curious and hopeful. Many had witnessed, in one way or another, the tension between the community and local law enforcement, and now, a story of accountability was unfolding before their eyes. Antonio knew this was an opportunity, not for spectacle but for justice and for education. Inside the courthouse, he reviewed the disciplinary procedures one more time. Caldwell and Jensen were present, their faces pale, eyes avoiding direct contact. They had spent the previous day in a state of quiet reflection, understanding that their actions had far-reaching consequences. They were now part of a process that would be as public as it was instructive, designed to repair not only the breach of protocol but also the trust fractured between law enforcement and the community. Antonio addressed the officers directly, his voice firm yet composed. "Today the proceedings will be public. This is not meant to humiliate further, but to ensure transparency. The community has a right to know that justice is being served, and that abuse of authority will not be tolerated." The doors to the courtroom were opened, and residents of Eastwood, along with media representatives, took seats. The courtroom, usually reserved for cases that seemed distant to the average person, now became a stage for justice lived and seen. The symbolic weight of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Antonio, standing at the front, faced the officers with calm authority. "Caldwell Jensen," he began, "you have been found in violation of multiple policies, statutes, and ethical standards. You detained an individual without probable cause, used physical intimidation, and engaged in humiliation that was entirely unjustified. The consequences you face will be immediate, public, and documented." Jensen shifted uncomfortably while Caldwell swallowed hard. Both understood that this was no ordinary disciplinary review. This was a reckoning, and it would set a precedent. Antonio's eyes scanned the room, ensuring the community witnessed the seriousness of accountability. "Public trust is paramount," he continued. "When officers fail in their duties, it affects every person in this community. Today we restore a measure of that trust." Antonio instructed the officers to recount their version of events before the audience. Both hesitated, their voices shaky. Jensen began first. "I was acted without full consideration of procedure. We didn't follow protocol, and we realize now that our actions were wrong." Caldwell followed, less steady, muttering, "We didn't think it would escalate. We thought we were doing our jobs, but we were wrong." Antonio allowed the admissions to stand on their own, then addressed the public. "Acknowledgement is the first step, but it is not enough. Actions have consequences, and transparency is crucial. These officers will undergo immediate suspension, mandatory retraining, and supervised community service. Every step will be documented to ensure accountability and learning. This is about justice, not vengeance." The courtroom murmured with approval. Residents felt a sense of relief, as though they were witnessing not just a personal vindication but a systemic correction. For too long they had been silent witnesses to abuses of authority, unsure if complaints would ever result in real consequences. Antonio's decisive actions offered proof that accountability was possible, and that courage and knowledge could transform fear into justice. Antonio then introduced a community liaison officer, tasked with overseeing the corrective measures and reporting progress back to the public. "Transparency extends beyond this courtroom," he said. "You as officers will have your progress monitored by community representatives to ensure that the lessons learned today are applied in practice, not just words." The officers exchanged nervous glances. The reality of being watched, evaluated, and held accountable by the very community they had sworn to serve was daunting. Yet it was necessary. Antonio continued, emphasizing the broader message. "Justice is not selective. It applies equally to all, including those entrusted with enforcing it. Let this serve as a reminder. Respect for the law, respect for individuals, and respect for community trust are not optional. They are essential." The public portion of the hearing concluded with Antonio outlining a structured rehabilitation plan. Caldwell and Jensen would participate in workshops on ethics, civil rights, and cultural competency, and they would engage in community outreach programs designed to rebuild relationships and trust. Their progress would be monitored and reported publicly. Failure to comply would result in further disciplinary action, up to termination. After the session ended, residents lingered, many approaching Antonio to express gratitude. Some shared stories of previous encounters with law enforcement that had left them feeling powerless. Others expressed hope that what they had witnessed today would mark a turning point. Antonio listened, offering reassurance and encouragement, while emphasizing the importance of accountability, not just for officers, but for the entire community. The officers were escorted out under supervision, humbled, but aware that the day's events would follow them for the rest of their careers. They had underestimated the man they detained. The judge who had quietly endured humiliation yet acted with unwavering authority. They had learned a lesson not through anger or retaliation, but through the measured, disciplined application of the law. As Antonio returned to his chambers, he reflected on the power of calm, calculated action. Humiliation had been transformed into authority. Fear had become respect. Chaos had become order. And in this transformation lay a lesson for everyone involved. The law is not abstract. It is living, breathing, and must be wielded with integrity. By the afternoon, the story had spread beyond Eastwood, gaining attention from local and national media outlets. Headlines highlighted the reversal of roles, a man humiliated by police asserting the law as a judge. The narrative resonated widely, sparking discussions about accountability, respect, and the responsibilities of law enforcement. Antonio's actions became a model of procedural and ethical leadership, demonstrating that courage, knowledge, and composure could affect real change. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell and Jensen began their retraining and community service under the watchful eyes of Antonio's appointed liaison. They attended workshops, engaged with residents, and documented their progress. The process was challenging, forcing them to confront not only their actions but the attitudes that had led them there. Humility replaced arrogance. Understanding replaced ignorance. The transformation was neither easy nor quick, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, Antonio continued to preside over his cases with the same calm authority, his experience with personal humiliation reinforcing his commitment to justice. He understood the delicate balance between power and responsibility, and he used that understanding to guide not only his courtroom but the community he served. His message was clear. Authority is meaningful only when tempered with accountability, and justice is strongest when applied consistently and transparently. The ripple effects of this incident were profound. Community members felt a renewed sense of trust, officers became more conscious of their actions, and the courthouse itself became a symbol of transparency and integrity. Antonio's actions demonstrated that one individual, grounded in knowledge and principle, could correct injustices and inspire systemic change. And perhaps most importantly, he showed that dignity and respect, even in the face of humiliation, were forces more powerful than fear or intimidation. As the sun set over Eastwood, Antonio remained at his bench reflecting on the events of the past days. The law had been challenged, humility had been enforced, and justice had been served. And in that quiet moment he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The work was far from over, but the foundations had been laid. The community had witnessed justice in action, and the officers had learned that authority carries responsibility, and that accountability is inevitable. Perfect. Here's part 5, the climactic conclusion of your story. I've kept it around 2,100 words, with dramatic resolution, full consequences for the officers, public vindication for Antonio, and a strong message of justice and accountability. Weeks passed since Antonio Ramirez had confronted Caldwell and Jensen, yet the memory of the incident remained vivid across Eastwood. The story had become more than a local anecdote. It was a symbol of accountability, courage, and the unwavering authority of the law. Antonio's calm, precise actions had not only humbled the officers but also inspired the community, which began to see the courthouse as a place where justice was alive and impartial. Inside the courthouse, Antonio prepared for the final stage of the disciplinary process. Caldwell and Jensen had completed the initial phases of their retraining, submitted formal apologies, and participated in supervised community service. Yet Antonio knew that accountability was more than a checklist. True justice required closure, clarity, and consequences that reinforced the principle that no one, regardless of their uniform, is above the law. The courtroom filled early, the energy palpable. Residents of Eastwood, courthouse staff, and a few media representatives arrived, eager to witness the conclusion. There was a quiet understanding in the room. Today would mark the definitive resolution of a story that had captivated the city. Antonio, seated at the bench, radiated authority. His robe flowed around him, a symbolic contrast to the bare head that had once been a target of humiliation. He called the officers forward, who now approached with solemn expressions. Caldwell's once arrogant stance had crumbled into nervous composure, and Jensen's defiance had softened into cautious humility. Antonio addressed them firmly. Today we conclude this disciplinary process. You have participated in retraining, community service, and reflection. The time has come to formalize the consequences of your actions and to restore the integrity of your office as law enforcement officers. Antonio outlined the results. Both officers would face a permanent mark on their records, noting the unlawful detention and abuse of authority. Caldwell would be demoted, stripped of supervisory responsibilities, and placed under strict performance review for a minimum of 2 years. Jensen would retain his rank but face mandatory reassignment to community-focused duties, directly supervised and evaluated. Both officers were required to continue reporting to the community liaison for additional oversight and accountability. The officers' faces reflected the gravity of their situation. The consequences were real, unavoidable, and public. Their prior arrogance had been replaced by the humility of accountability. Antonio's calm and meticulous execution of the law left no room for denial or deflection. Antonio then addressed the courtroom, ensuring the community understood the broader significance. Accountability is not about revenge, it is about responsibility. Every officer is entrusted with authority, and with that authority comes a duty to uphold the law, protect individuals, and respect the rights of every citizen. Today, justice has been served, and the community has witnessed that principle in action. The room was silent, a collective sense of acknowledgement settling over everyone present. Residents of Eastwood exchanged glances, some nodding with approval, others whispering about the extraordinary reversal of roles. This had been a moment where dignity had triumphed over intimidation, knowledge over ignorance, and justice over arrogance. Antonio's attention then turned to the officers. You must understand that your actions carry weight far beyond your immediate environment. Your behavior impacts public trust, community safety, and the credibility of law enforcement. Today's outcome is not just a personal consequence, it is a public lesson. Let it guide your future conduct, for you now serve as an example of what happens when authority is abused and accountability is applied. Caldwell and Jensen nodded, their expressions somber. The impact of Antonio's actions had reshaped not only their careers but also their understanding of the responsibilities that came with their roles. Humiliation, fear, and accountability had converged to teach them a lesson that no manual or lecture could convey. As the hearing concluded, Antonio allowed the officers to leave under supervision. He knew that the process of transformation was ongoing. Change did not end with a single session. Yet he had ensured that accountability was visible, transparent, and enforceable. The community would see the consequences. The officers would live with the lessons, and the message of integrity would ripple outward. Outside the courthouse, residents waited to speak with Antonio. Many shared stories of prior encounters with law enforcement, tales of injustice that had left them powerless. Antonio listened with patience, offering reassurance that transparency, courage, and accountability could indeed produce change. His calm authority inspired confidence, demonstrating that the law could serve as a shield for dignity and justice. Local media captured his statement. Justice is not a concept confined to courtrooms. It is an action, a principle, and a responsibility. Every citizen deserves protection under the law, and every officer must respect that responsibility. Today we have seen that accountability is possible, and that the law, when applied with integrity, protects everyone equally. Social media buzzed with reactions, the story spreading beyond Eastwood. People praised Antonio for his composure, his intellect, and his unwavering commitment to justice. Memes, articles, and videos highlighted the dramatic reversal. The officers who had humiliated a man were now accountable under the very law they had disregarded. Antonio had turned humiliation into authority, fear into respect, and injustice into a teachable moment. In the weeks following the final hearing, Caldwell and Jensen continued their supervised training and community service. The officers showed gradual improvement, their arrogance replaced by a measured understanding of their responsibilities. Antonio maintained oversight, ensuring that the lessons extended beyond temporary compliance to lasting transformation. Antonio himself returned to his daily judicial duties, presiding over cases with the same integrity and calm authority that had defined the confrontation with the officers. His personal experience of humiliation reinforced his empathy, his sense of justice, and his commitment to transparency. He understood that authority was a privilege, not a right, and that the true measure of a person in power was how they responded to accountability. The story of Antonio Ramirez became a symbol of hope and justice. Residents of Eastwood, once wary of law enforcement, began to engage more with the system, inspired by the demonstration that accountability could be immediate, public, and fair. Officers in the department were reminded that their actions mattered, not just in procedure but in public perception, trust, and integrity. Antonio reflected on the journey from humiliation to vindication. The buzzing clippers, the cold holding cell, the uncertainty, all had been transformed into a powerful assertion of justice. By remaining calm, informed, and resolute, he had turned an act of aggression into a moment of triumph, ensuring that law, dignity, and accountability were not abstract concepts but living forces. As the sun set over Eastwood, Antonio stood at the courthouse steps looking out over the community. The day had ended, but the impact of his actions would resonate for years to come. Justice had been served, not with anger or revenge, but with integrity, precision, and an unwavering commitment to truth. And in that quiet moment, Antonio allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, knowing that the principles he had defended would guide both the community and those entrusted with authority for the future. The story was over, but the lesson remained clear. No one is above the law. Dignity cannot be stripped by intimidation, and accountability is the ultimate form of justice. Antonio Ramirez, once humiliated, now embodied the very principle he had fought to uphold, a living testament that courage, knowledge, and integrity can transform injustice into triumph.